Flex your business with an American Express Business Gold Card. You'll earn 4 times membership rewards points on your top 2 eligible spending categories, like transit and electronics, each month, on up to $150K in combined purchases per year. Plus, you can now earn 3 times membership rewards points on flights and prepaid hotels booked on AmexTravel.com. Terms and points cap apply. Learn more at AmericanExpress.com/business-gold. Amex Business Gold, built for business by American Express.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon. Sometimes the most painful part of getting sick is the getting better part. Waiting on hold for an appointment, sitting in crowded waiting rooms, standing in line at the pharmacy, that's painful. Amazon One Medical and Amazon Pharmacy remove those painful parts of getting better with things like 24/7 virtual visits and prescriptions delivered to your door. Thanks to Amazon Pharmacy and Amazon One Medical, healthcare just got less painful.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and today I'm so pleased to welcome back to the show once again, Amy McElroy. Amy, welcome back.
Thanks, Rebecca. I'm really happy to be here. I loved last time, so thank you.
I really enjoyed our conversation last time too. And I think the last time we talked, you had mentioned that you had 2 books out and you were working on a third one to be released in 2025, which is coming up very shortly. I guess by the time this airs, it will already be 2025. So congratulations.
Thank you very much.
But today we're going to talk about your second book, which is called Women's Lives in the Tudor Era. And I think any Tudor fan is obsessed with learning more about women because, let's be honest, for centuries, it's been all about men, hasn't it?
Yeah, that is very true. Yeah.
So I think I want to start off today, and this might be a little bit of a curveball for you, but I'm kind of curious if going into this book, you had any preconceived notions on Tudor women and what their lives looked like, and did that change by the end?
Yes. So to be honest, I didn't expect to find how many different roles were available to women or the extent to which they actually contributed to society. And I don't mean that in such a negative way as it sounds. I thought there was very strict roles and that kind of thing and the contributions that they could do because it was a man's society. So yes, I did go into it thinking quite narrowly and my eyes were fully opened. So, yes.
Well, that's good. And your book is kind of written chronologically from like youth through widowhood. But today I'm not necessarily going to talk in that order because I felt drawn to specific subjects in the book. And I think where I really want to start is at marriage. And one of the things that I think is important to discuss is that I think we forget during Tudor times that their lives were really ruled by the church and by religion, and you couldn't get married just any day you wanted, could you?
Absolutely not. There was so many days that they could not get married. It like holy days, things like that. It was just not possible. So the church wouldn't allow it. So I think there was, I can't remember what it was, over 100, maybe 200 days of the year that they were not allowed to get married on. So yeah, it was very strictly dealt with by the church on what days you could get married. Of course, if you were rich, you could buy your way out of that with a license, but
of course,
most people weren't rich. So.
And you also couldn't have, let's see, what's the cleanest way for me to say this? You couldn't have, I'm just going to say it. Couples couldn't have sex on certain days of the year either, right? Wasn't there some rules about certain holidays as well that you couldn't?
Yes. So again, it was all to do with the year of the church, like how the holy days fell, things like that. So it was, I'm sure most people did, but it was frowned upon. So I think that the real pious people probably would have kept to that. But yes, their lives were well and truly interwoven with the church.
Yeah. Or maybe if a husband and wife did not like each other very much, they could use that as excuse.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, not tonight.
Yeah. Headache excuse.
One of the other things is they were very superstitious during this time as well, weren't they?
Yes, they were. So they would they would see signs. So for instance, depending on the weather on the day of the marriage and things like that, that they would think that they were omens on how that marriage was going to turn out. So definitely more superstitious than us these days. I don't think many people today would wake up on their wedding day and, well, we might wake up and think it's raining on my wedding day, but we wouldn't necessarily think that that meant something to the future of our wedding, whereas they did then. So yes, it was very superstitious in how they saw things and how they took signs of what the future of their marriage would look like
I
or how
mean,
happy it would be or
let's
not.
be real. It rains a lot in England, doesn't it? So the
It
odds of
did.
having a sunny wedding, I think, are pretty small.
Yes. Yeah.
I feel like the whole wedding thing is so intriguing to me because it is so different than what we experience now. Because obviously they didn't wear a white wedding dress either.
No, they would the majority of women would just wear their best. If they couldn't afford a new gown, they would wear something that they already had. They did often try and wear a bright colour. Um, but obviously back then bright colours were expensive. So it was a kind of form of wearing what is the most expensive thing I own.
Yeah.
Some people did borrow gowns. So there was an element, white just wasn't the wedding gown back then. But yes, people would either borrow or they would make one or wear something that they already had. Hopefully a bright colour as they saw it as I'm wearing something that's more expensive than what I'd usually wear on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I find that so interesting. See if I get this right. My great grandparents were married in the late 19th century here in the US. And my great grandmother was just wearing like, it looks, well, it's a black and white photo, so it's hard to tell, but it looks like it's dark colored fabric
Oh,
and
wow.
just some nice dress that she had, and I see the similarities there and I go, oh, this is probably similar to something that the Tudors would have done.
Yeah, yeah.
I love that.
Were what they could. Obviously, they would still make an effort, so they might have a bouquet, but it wouldn't be what we associate today with roses and ribbons, and it would be something that they've picked or that their ladies have picked for them. They'd have meanings behind them. So, for instance, like rosemary would be incorporated, and things like that, that have a meaning to the bride and things like that. So again, another little bit of superstition, but I guess the scent also helps. So
Yes. And then once they're married, okay, so every once in a while when I read a book, there's just like little tidbits of information that comes out where you go, oh, well, that's interesting. I never would have thought of that. And one of those things from your book was what going to church looks like as a married couple. And I think I just assumed that the married couple would always sit next to one another, but that wasn't always the case, was it?
no, men and women would generally sit apart. For the bride, it would change in sorry, in where she sat. So as a single lady, they would sit away from the married women, but obviously once she's married, she can then sit on the married women's pews. So she kind of changed her role in society. So she would be welcomed into that part of the church. She would be able to sit there with the other married ladies, but generally, yeah, she would sit with the ladies and the man would stay with his fellow menfolk.
I I don't even know what to say about that. Like, what does it matter?
No idea at all, but it did to them. So,
Yeah, yeah, just keep them segregated, right? Keep the women separated from the
yeah.
men. Okay, so another weird question that I have for you, and that I thought maybe other people have thought about this question before, is did Tudor women wear a wedding band, or was there some way that the single men around knew that this woman was taken?
Okay, so people did wear rings. Not all, but there were, I suppose, wedding bands, but they weren't just a wedding band as we would recognize today. So it could be a ring of any description. It could have a stone in it, it could not, various materials. The main way to tell that a woman was married was by her hair. So single women did not need to cover their hair. Some did. They might just wear a small cap over the top of their hair. But most married women would cover their hair. So that was a big difference. If somebody was covering their hair, then you knew she was married, or at least don't approach because not interested, kind of thing.
Hmm.
Um, so yes, that was the main signal that she had her head covering on. So yeah, right, no wedding band. Well, there were wedding bands, but the hair cover was the main one.
I mean,
Unless, of course, you're in the royal court where they all wore head coverings or French
right.
hoods or English gable hoods or
Yeah, so it could complicate things a little bit.
yeah. I would guess that those at the royal court knew who was married and who wasn't.
Yeah. And of course, marriages were mostly arranged. They weren't love matches, were they?
Amongst the aristocracy, most were arranged. As you go down the social scale, there was more leeway. Usually because, to put it bluntly, if you're a woman and you marry, everything you own becomes your husband's, unless you're an heiress and can be protected with contracts and all of that kind of stuff, which majority of women couldn't. So there wasn't that need to try and ensure that you were marrying upwards or at least equal as you go down the lower scale, because it was like you've got nothing to lose anyway. So common women would have had more say in who they could marry. They'd be given a bit more freedom in who they could choose. And a lot of working women met their partners through work. So if they were in domestic service per se, they might be working in the same household, would meet a partner that way. So there was much more freedom down the the lower end of the scale.
So if you're a romantic, that would be the end of the scale that you would want to be on.
Definitely, yes. Unless you're very, very lucky and you have a family who's supportive of your choice. But I
Yeah.
can't see that happening very much.
But other than that, if you're in this arranged marriage and your husband's a jerk, I mean, there's only a certain number of ways to get out of it, one including murder.
Yeah. Yes.
I was like, if I could think about how to get out of a marriage in the Tudor times, it wasn't an easy process, but it seems like killing your husband might have been the easier way. I do not condone this. I'm just saying.
You're absolutely right. There was very few ways. They could separate. The church didn't like it, and they would try and encourage couples to work on it. But there were couples that lived apart. But in the same way, there was also husbands that would abandon their wives, and the wife could do nothing. She couldn't remarry.
Right.
She couldn't get a divorce. Adultery still couldn't divorce. Yeah, so it was very, very tough to get out of a marriage. It could be done, but you would need quite a lot of money and some backing with the church. So I don't need to say which end of the social scale that was more available at. So
Right. Yeah, exactly. And let's be real. If you did, by chance, hypothetically speaking, in Tudor times, murder your husband, I'm just saying that would probably be the best way out because then maybe if you didn't have any children, maybe you'd end up with some money for yourself.
Uh,
I'm just saying you'd be a widow. Is that so bad?
Sergeant and Mr. Smith, you're gonna love this house.
Bunk beds in a closet?
There's no field manual for finding the right home. But when you do, USAA Homeowners Insurance can help protect it the right way. Restrictions apply.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Well,
I'm sorry.
in a way, you're right. You'd be out of the marriage. But for a Tudor woman to murder her husband was kind of classed as petty treason.
Sorry.
So, she'd actually be burnt to death. Obviously, she would have to be found and sentenced. So
Right.
there's a chance she may not, but that was the punishment for a woman. It was seen as petty treason to kill her husband because he's seen as, in a way, in one word, her master. So
Yeah. Well, it seems like when we watch these historical fiction TV series or movies, that's what I'm just going to call them historical fiction because they're not 100% accurate. We talk about Mary Tudor, the Queen of France, who in the Showtimes, the Tudors smothered her husband so she could marry who she wanted. And then we have Firebrand with Catherine Parr. Spoiler alert, smothers Henry VIII at the end. So there were ways. I mean, obviously.
yeah, and women back then, most of them had a very good knowledge of herbs and things. So who knows?
Right? Poison was like, that was the women's way of doing it, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Why am I still talking about this? I am not married, just so you know, there is no husband who has to be worried about me too. I just think it's curious, what a different time to live in as a
Definitely.
woman to not be able to have your own autonomy, basically, is what it comes down to. It's just
And not be able to leave. Like if you're in an abusive relationship, if your husband is cheating on you, if he is spending all of the household income and leaving you with no food, you still can't leave. I find that quite disturbing in a way. Obviously, it's a completely different time. But if you think of how many women probably went through something, then it is quite a sad reality for how they lived compared to today.
Yeah, it really is. It makes you grateful to live in the 20 and
Definitely.
21st centuries for sure. One of the things that you had mentioned a little earlier was working women, and I'm glad that you mentioned that phrase because that is a chapter in your book. And I'll be honest, the first time I read working women, I immediately thought prostitutes. But I mean, that's like the term that we use now. She's a working woman, or
Yes.
But that's not necessarily what you meant by this, was it?
No, it was women that had all different roles. So their occupation. So maybe I should have called it occupational women.
No, I liked working women. It made me giggle when I read it. So the working women themselves, were they married women or were they single women or was it a mixture of both?
Mixture. So the biggest employer was domestic service. So it ranged from all kinds of houses. So you could be one maid in a household and your workload would be absolutely everything that you can think of, or you could be a lady in waiting to the queen or princess. And, your tasks would be completely different to that one sole maid that works in a very small household. It just depended on the income. You could obviously work your way up, which a lot of people did. Most women would not work in domestic service once they married, or if they would, their contract would kind of change. So when they were single, they would do a 1 year or 2 year contract within the household. They would live there. The quarters were separate, so male and female servants were slept separately. But once they got married, a lot of households didn't necessarily want couples working in their households, or if they did, they may provide accommodation or increase their wages so they could live off site. So there was less interruption for other servants that remained in the household, but a lot of women would work a year somewhere, and the next year when their contract was coming up, they may either try and move up the scale a bit, so go to a little bit of a nice household, and that way they could slowly work up and up. Obviously, there was a limit, so if you weren't from the aristocracy, you're not going to find yourself a lady in waiting to the queen, if you haven't got those connections. But other than that, you could work your way up to a very nice household where your chores would change. So you may not have to scrub the floors anymore. Your role may just be getting your mistress dressed and keeping her company for the day. So, and then once you were married, you could, as I said, still work in domestic service, but you may live off site if a room isn't provided for you. Other married women would be called in on a more casual basis, so they may be asked to attend for if a household was doing big parties, that kind of thing, to help prepare the household for those types of events. Or if you're lucky enough and you're in a royal court or somebody of the aristocracy, then yes, you could still be in domestic service because obviously they had a lot more room and things like that. So there was a lot less restrictions and being able to work there and stay on site as well. So
Yeah. And once you were married, you're a married woman, and let's say you are of the nobility, you now have a household to run, don't you?
oh yes, yep. So you've now got your own to manage as well. Um, it was then, you know, a bit of choice, a bit of have I been ordered to attend? So if you were ordered by the Queen to come and wait on her, I don't think you're going to say no. In that case, you would have to have somebody that's looking after your household for you, whether that's a steward or whoever would be looking after your affairs in your absence. But ultimately, you could just go back to your own property, manage your household, attend the court for any parties or events, celebrations, things like that. But yes, you would effectively, all the skills that you'd learnt growing up would now come into action in how do I manage my own household and manage all of my own servants, and yes.
I like let's dive into that a little bit further because I'm fascinated by so you learn these skills as you are a youth and adolescent as you're working your way up to being a married woman. Once you've learned these skills and now you are running your household, what type of things are you actually doing? Because I think it's easy to go, oh, well, you're making sure that the meals are prepared as they should be and things look a certain way, but it was a lot more than that, wasn't it?
Oh, definitely. I think again, I know I keep saying this, but depending on the household, you may be fully stuck in there. So you might be in the kitchen with your chef, like planning what shopping do we need. And us to go shopping is either jump on the internet and have it delivered or pop down to one place and buy everything. For them, it was market, all of that kind of thing. Where could they get certain products? What did they need for events coming up? Obviously, they had harvest to think about. So how are they going to manage all of that produce? That was all obviously it wasn't the woman's remit to go and farm lands and stuff, but it was her remit of what produce do we need in the household, and then what can go off to be sold at market or traded. So she'd have to understand like the seasons, what was coming up, if they had any events to plan for. how to store food, so pickling, smoking, that kind of thing, to keep food ready for the household, especially when you're coming up to winter. Ensure that the household is stocked. So you could be in the kitchen planning or even cooking with your chef or cook or whatever you've got in there. But as well as that, it's your responsibility to make sure that your servants are all fed themselves, that they're all doing what they should be. Obviously, if you're very high up in the scale, you would have different ladies that do that for you, but they all report to you. So you've still got that overarching responsibility of making sure your household is running effectively. And there's other things such as cleaning. So you may not do it yourself, but you're going to inspect it because you want to know that your servants are doing their jobs, and you're responsible for paying them, or your steward might do it for you, but you're the one that's signing off the accounts, especially if your husband is away somewhere. So there was a lot of responsibility that went in it. A lot of women would go to the market themselves. They may take servants with them to carry things, as I don't blame them, but depending on the size of your household, you are going to be involved in a lot of stuff. I don't think it is as simple as just having a load of staff and you're just going, yeah, they're doing what I asked them to do. That's all fine. You might be up first thing helping with the livestock, so chickens, pigs, all of that kind of stuff, making sure they're all fed and looked after. Obviously, if you've got kids, there's all of the childcare, that's your responsibility. So, yeah, a lot of work went into managing a household, regardless of the size, I would say. So,
Yeah.
without a lot of the benefits that we have today.
Wow. Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the kids because I wanted to ask about that too, because that's a whole nother level of the job as a wife is when you have young children in the house. Now you are either responsible to teach them yourself or bring in a tutor if you can afford one, I'd assume, right?
Yes. So if a woman would usually start off the education of her children, but she's limited to her own education. So it could be that she is more than capable of teaching them their prayers, their ABC, and then maybe even reading. Other women may not have that ability, so they may be able to teach them their prayers, but if they didn't really understand Latin, they were teaching words essentially. So they were just learning by memory what they'd learned from the church, they're passing on to their children. So it was entirely dependent on the education of the mum, at least to start with. And then if they could afford or could enable their children to go to school, if they didn't need them for, this is going to sound really awful, but for labour at home, then they could send their children to school or have a tutor if they were able to afford to do so.
It's it just blows my mind so much that women were not educated as well as men, and yet the women were the one teaching their children.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, it fell to the women.
Yeah, and the whole Latin thing also blows my mind that people would just recite the words and not necessarily know what they meant. Like the thought process behind that makes no sense to me whatsoever, other than men being men and not wanting to share what they know, or the church not wanting to share what they know and keeping that power unto themselves. I just,
Yes, I think it is. I personally could not learn something that's just words if I don't understand the meaning behind it. It would just, I just couldn't do it. I might be able to recite a load of words and not know what they mean, but it would annoy me that I didn't know what they meant. So it was very, very difficult, not only to be in that position yourself, but then you're trying to teach your children those same words without any explanation of what they mean, other than, oh, it's a prayer. You're saying your prayers. That's it. So Must have been very, very difficult for some of them. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And then we have people like Lady Jane Grey, who I love that you talked about her in the book because I feel like she is one of those young people in the Tudor era who was well educated, and we hear about it all of the time. Let's talk about maybe, I'm trying to think in the book, what you wrote about was basically what I recall is the most common story that we hear about Lady Jane Grey and her education and her upbringing. Do you want to talk about that?
Is it the one that's with Roger Ascham?
Yes.
One. Yeah, so the story goes that Roger Ascham was visiting Lady Jane, well, not her, but her family, and he found Lady Jane alone and asked her where her family were, and they were all out having fun. So they were out, I believe it was hunting. And when he came across her, she was actually reading a copy of Plato in Greek.
In Greek.
And he essentially, along the lines, said, well, why are you not out with your family having fun? And her response was essentially that she would prefer to be reading books than out doing sportly pursuits. So he was quite astonished by that, that not only is she choosing to stay at home alone, read Greek, but she's thoroughly enjoying it. And yeah, blew his mind, I think. So
I
hence why
think
we still know about it today.
I just think it's so interesting to look at her versus maybe some other figures from the time because Jane Grey was the daughter of Francis Brandon, essentially, who was the daughter of Mary Tudor, Queen of France, sister of Henry VIII. I wish there weren't two Mary Tudors. It gets so confusing, doesn't it? So by birth, Jane Grey had a way better chance of being well educated.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I think sadly for Jane, it does appear that her parents weren't totally on board for how far she wanted to take her education. She does mention things about they pinched her and things like that. So I think being the family that they did have the responsibility to ensure their daughters were educated to a level. But Lady Jane's education was like the next level. Like, I don't think that was expected at all. She did most of that off her own back, which you've got to give her credit for. Um, but yes, she would have been expected to have a good education, but I don't think anybody would have written in the rule book that they should all learn Greek. And yeah, but she did it. So
Yeah,
fair
she's
play.
she's amazing. So a lot of the times, children's wardships were purchased, and I'm going to use Jane Grey as an example since her wardship was purchased by Thomas Seymour. What was the idea behind selling the wardship of your child?
So a wardship generally meant that somebody else would take on responsibility for looking after that child. Now, wardship traditionally was a ward of the crown. So you were the responsibility of the crown. The crown then began to sell on these wardships, partly because they could get income from them, but it also helped alleviate numbers at court, extra mouths to feed, but also showed favour to those that they were selling them to. For the person that bought the wardship, generally it meant that most wardships were for children who were heirs or heiresses and their parents had died. And it meant that they, until the child came of age, they could use that child's income as they pleased. They could do what they want. They could, you know, spend it all on themselves and nobody could say anything. They did have a responsibility to ensure that the child was maintained and ensure they had the education that they were expected to have, more so for boys. and they could even arrange marriages. So it was essentially like a second parent. But once the child came of age, then they would then inherit their inheritance, or, what was left of it. It hasn't all been sold. The Crown could, of course, put limits on things. So they could say that you can't sell X or Y or things like that, or that the marriage remains the prerogative of the court, of the monarch, things like that. So there were limits in some, but it was essentially favour that, I've got this person under my wardship. I can use part of that income. And you'd like to think that most people would have used it maybe to their own benefit to an extent, but to ensure that that child did receive their inheritance once they came of age and in a status that they should have it. So, they're not at any detriment. They're still getting their annual income. And, for some, it might have even been better than when it started, depending on what the ward owner had done. So,
Yeah, yeah. And let's be real, Thomas Seymour's intent behind purchasing Jane Grey's wardship was for his own benefit, obviously. And he had promised her parents that he would wed her to Edward VI, which I think Edward would have been very keen about. But I think other people at court did not agree with this idea without having some knowledge about it in advance.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, Thomas is one of those people that I can never fully figure out, and I don't know if I ever will. But yeah,
He is an
I
enigma.
don't think he made the best of the situation, should we say?
I feel like in my research on him, I've just discovered that he and I are very much alike. I feel like we're both somewhat middle children who are just trying to get some attention. And we're like, what can I do to get some attention? So, you know what? I'm going to buy the wardship of Jane Grey, and then I'm going to promise her parents that I'm going to marry her to the king, and everything is going to be fine. Nobody is going to be upset about this. Why would you be mad? Oh,
I don't
Thomas.
think he thought forward much.
Yeah, you know what? I might agree with that. Yeah, he was a little bit reckless in some
Yeah.
instances, but anyway, I could talk about him all day. You know this. So, so we've talked a little bit about wardships. One of the other things that I would like to talk about a little bit is what women did in their free time. Did they have social circles? Did they get together and play pinochle or cards or cribbage or
They did. I think some would, even their social gatherings could be at the river while they're doing their laundry. I know that sounds quite depressing to us because, we don't go to the river to wash our clothes. But for them, it could be they would all go and they'd all be chatting whilst they're doing their laundry. So, makes it less boring than it would be. Others, they would spend their time at each other's household. So they may share food, drink. Um, they may have a host that is happy to provide that for them, or they may each bring something like we may today. We may take a bottle of wine to somebody's house and things like that. So in that aspect, it wasn't that much different, but um, they would spend time embroidering together, or even if they could read, somebody may read aloud to their friends. So they may sit outside in the summer, read a book or a pamphlet, depending on what they've got access to. They may spend time indoors doing their needlework, and it might not be the embroidery that we think of with that the queens and the princesses were doing, all beautiful and intricate. It may just be mending clothes, but they would spend that time together. And then taverns. So women would go to taverns. So, we are British. We like the pub. So they would certainly spend their time there. That was usually married women, and they would go in the company of their husbands. But women could go to a tavern and have a drink and have some food and spend time with friends. So, yeah.
it's nice to think that maybe they had some type of social life.
Yes, yes. And of course, there was things like not necessarily things that I'd want to go to, but bear baiting and things like that that they could go and watch, like the blood sports and even a public hanging, if that's your thing. They they might want to go and watch that. That was a big public spectacle. So you'd have people there selling drinks and food and yeah, it was like a big day out for some, but yeah.
I thought you were going to say people selling T-shirts and I witnessed so and so's execution T-shirts. It does seem so different, doesn't it? Because we would never even fathom going to witness some of the stuff that they used to go to.
No, definitely not. Like, if you said to me, do you want to go and watch a chicken buried in the ground and throw stones at it? No, no, I don't. Thank you. Like, or a dog attack a bear? No,
Right.
I'm gonna watch that.
Yeah.
No.
See, we have television now. That's our weird form of entertainment. We can watch whatever we want now. So yeah, yeah. Well, and I'm glad that you talked about women meeting each other as they're doing laundry. I can't like it's something about that seems kind of sweet and cute. Like, oh, it's Tuesday. Bertha and Agnes are gonna be down by the river. I can't wait to catch up with them, type of a deal.
Go and have a gossip.
Yes, yeah, because what else did you have to do?
Yeah.
But one of the other things that I want to talk about, and I kind of cover this occasionally on the show, but cleanliness. So we're talking about washing clothes by the river and cleanliness in general. I think there's such a preconceived notion that the Tudors were not clean, but they actually were, weren't they?
They were. Obviously, they did not have what we have today. They didn't have showers, and very, very few had running water, but they were very clean to the best of their ability. So the clothing that they wore, they would wear a linen smock, and the idea was that the material would wick away the sweat, and they would change that. So in the winter, they probably wouldn't bathe, but because they saw it as, the cold air is bad for them, it can get in through their pores and make them very ill. So they would probably avoid bathing to an extent, especially in winter, but they would definitely be changing their smocks to make sure any sweat was wicked away and it was gone. They would clean their teeth. So not they didn't have toothbrushes and toothpaste like we do today, but they would have some kind of utensil or even just their finger that they would use different substance on. Like one was charcoal, I believe, that they would just rub it. And, we see toothpaste today that's got charcoal in. So they weren't far off. They would wash their hands and their faces quite a lot. So hands were always washed before eating, things like that. They would wash their faces in the morning when they wake up. So yes, I think there definitely is a preconception. I do think it is an incorrect one. I'm sure, there were some smelly people back then, but to be fair, we have smelly people today. So
Yeah.
I don't think that it's anything that they could have done differently with what they had available to them. So, they made the most of what they had and tried using materials to help. So whether it was a linen smock or wool, so they'd wear wool as well. So yeah, I think they definitely tried to help themselves as much as they could in keeping clean and using what they could.
Yeah. So they would wash the white cotton smock that was underneath. The gown itself was of a fabric that you couldn't necessarily wash. So they would find other ways to clean it. And here's where my strange mind goes. Okay. Are you ready for this, Amy?
Oh God, I don't know.
So this sometimes I think about these weird things, and I don't know if other people think about these things or if it's just me. So they have these big, beautiful gowns, right? And they eat with their hands mostly. Did these people not spill on their clothes? And if they did, if they were messy eaters and they got food all over their dresses, how did they clean those?
They probably did spill. They would have a cloth that would sit on their shoulder that they would wipe their hands on.
Okay.
So similar to how we would have napkins today. So they would use that. If they spilled, then it could be cleaned, not to us putting it in a machine to clean, but they were able to like brush things out. I assume if something was completely ruined, it was ruined. But I think then they didn't have a lot of the food dyes that we have and things like that. Things were a lot more natural in terms of food. So it probably would have been easier for them to remove food stains than it is for us, which when you think about it is quite odd that they had it easier than we do with stain removal. But yes, they would brush their clothes and things like that and try and get things clean that way if they couldn't, go and dunk it in the river and scrub it.
Yeah. I don't know why I think of these strange things, but I'm like, that we have messy eaters today, right? There's just some people who are messy eaters and they'll just get food all over themselves no matter how hard they try not to. Clearly, there
And
were
they,
people.
they did use the, like herbs and things to keep things smelling nice. And there were females that were employed at, for instance, the royal court. So we know that Henry himself had a laundry lady. So she was provided with different things to keep his clothes washed or cleaned at least. So he could, go and spill food down them again.
Okay, so here's the other thing. So people were wise enough to wash their hands before they ate,
Yeah.
but yet when it comes to childbirth, they didn't understand the hygiene that was necessary to wash your hands while delivering a child. Like this, I don't understand it, Amy.
So it's sadly, childbirth was, well, this bit isn't really sad. I guess it's understandable. That was the woman's remit. So very, very few had any male presence in the birthing chamber, whether that was on the floor of your own home or in a full birthing chamber that had been prepared for you. Um, Women weren't doctors then, so their knowledge was essentially limited to either being passed down, and that could be a local wise woman that had gained a lifetime of knowledge, delivered multiple children, and she passes it down to somebody else. It could be that somebody has had the good fortune of being allowed to accompany a male doctor, but obviously those experiences were very, very limited. But essentially, there was no training for midwifery. It was learn as you go. And I think one of the things that I'd find most surprising is if you were a single lady, you technically shouldn't be in a birthing chamber. So you weren't, it did happen, but you weren't really meant to be there until you were married. Then you could accompany other ladies into somebody's birthing chamber, but it was seen as this should be married women, and I just think, well, how are you meant to learn then? So, you get married and the expectation is you fall pregnant as soon as possible. So you may not even have any experience until you're in the birthing chamber yourself and you've never ever seen anybody else give birth. I find that, not that we go and watch other people give birth, but I think back then there was so little knowledge. There was no qualification for a midwife. It was, in fact, they were meant to be licensed. Most weren't, and the church couldn't keep on top of it. But they kind of turned a blind eye to ensure that women got the help they needed, which is good. But I think there was so many that were just doing what they could to help other women just because they'd experienced it themselves, which I suppose in a way you can think at least they had somebody there to help them rather than be left alone. But I just find it so strange that, you could just go into a birthing chamber and help somebody give birth. I wouldn't have a clue.
Yeah.
if it happened, if somebody called me into a birthing chamber, I don't know. I don't know.
But maybe I'm just gonna stay up here by your head. I'll hold your hand.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Squeeze my hand, but staying here. Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder if it were different then for the lower class because they wouldn't have as much room. I suspect the lower class subjects live in smaller quarters, so they wouldn't be able to do a lying in like the aristocracy did. Is that correct?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, they would essentially give birth where they could. Some would be working right up until they actually went into labor. Some were lucky, so there were women of the higher social status that would come and help. So they had a lot of knowledge of herbs and obviously had access to them because most of them had still rooms, etc. So they may help like prepare some tonics or something to try and help
Yeah.
the lady in labor, but ultimately you didn't have the luxury of having a whole room prepared for you, having a separate bed that you could give birth in. You didn't have any of that. You literally just had your home as it was, and that was it. And the
Right.
help of any women around you that were willing to come to your aid, essentially.
Yeah. And I'm sure the lower class women didn't have a churching ceremony, did they?
Uh, I think they did, but not to the extent that somebody rich would. So it was a big thing to be for a queen per se to be welcomed back at the royal court once she'd given birth. For the lower classes, it was more she can get back into society and she can start working again.
Mm.
So it was she still had to be, in I don't like this word, so it's something that they call the cleansing. Like I don't like that at all because I don't think that they were dirty, and I know it did change, but I think that they did need that blessing to be able to get back to work and things like that. But obviously not to the extent of a huge ceremony with pageantry and all of that kind of stuff. They wouldn't have had any of that. It would
No.
have been a simple go to the church, have your blessing, and then off you pop back to work.
You know, one of the things that I learned from your book that I honestly knew nothing about, and I had read about lying in and churching, I didn't know there was a middle phase to both of those things. So a woman goes into lying in to give birth. She gives birth, but then at some point after giving birth and the churching ceremony, what did you call it? Sitting up? So,
Yeah, there's the sitting up. So yes. Um, that I would say was the the aristocracy. It was kind of a rest period for the new mother, give her body a chance to recover, but also get her to the point where she could have guests, because obviously you weren't allowed men in the room, that kind of thing. When she was able to sit up was a signal that she's halfway now. She's going to be coming back to society soon, so more people could visit, things like that. So yes, it was a midway point to her churching ceremony.
yeah. And then at some point, I would assume after that, they could get up and walk around the room.
Yes. So she at that point, once she's done her sitting up, she'd be able to get up and walk around. I'm sure many did before the sitting up ceremony. It was just not advertised, so to speak. It was,
Yeah.
you know, the women dream it. What happens behind closed doors stays behind closed doors. If a queen wants to get up and walk around, you're not going to tell her no, are you? So I imagine they did what they felt comfortable with, but there was the guidelines of this is now her sitting up and then her churching ceremony afterwards.
I thank you for writing about that because that is the very first time I had ever read anything about that being one of the stages.
Oh, you're welcome.
That
It was
was,
interesting to research, to be honest, because I think in my mind I hadn't realised how long that period can be between when you enter that chamber and coming out of that chamber. It could be a very, very long time. Obviously, if you had the privilege to be able to do so, which many, many did not.
Right. Well, I mean, if we look at nowadays, I'm thinking back to the early 2000s when I had my daughter, how different it probably is, right? I went into a hospital, I gave birth, 2 days later I was home.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you get some maternity leave so you can spend time with your child, but really it's get right back to it. We're like the lower class. We're like, okay, we need you back in the workforce, honey. Let's do
Yeah.
this.
And I bet you didn't sit in bed for a month before either.
No, I worked right up, right up to the end. I can't even imagine what that would have been like to sit for like a month just
In a
waiting.
dark room.
Yeah,
Hmm.
that would have driven me absolutely crazy, Amy. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. Oh my gosh. Well, I feel, every time you're on now, I feel like we could talk forever, but was there anything that I missed today that you wanted to make sure that we discussed?
Um, I think the only thing I'd say that for those that are interested in Tudor women, one of the things that I found most fascinating was wills. So
Yeah.
women's wills, you can just do a search online. There's lots on the internet. Some of them can be very, very difficult to read, but a lot do have transcriptions, and they're just fascinating. So the things that they owned, most women did not have a will because A, they didn't have a lot to leave, or B, if they were married, they had to have their husband's permission to write a will. Um, so, but the ones that did leave them, it's just I find it really interesting in what they owned and who they were bequeathing gifts to. For instance, their servants and stuff. I think it's quite nice to see those types of gifts, even if it is like something like I give my maid Mary a sheep. It's just quite nice to see who they were thinking of when they were writing that will.
Yeah, I enjoyed that too. That was one of the things in my research that I came across was the will of Marjorie Seymour, Thomas and Jane's mother. And to me, the most fascinating thing that came out of that will was the fact that she excluded her eldest son, Edward, from the will. It's just those little pieces of information where you go, oh, this gives it a whole new like family dynamic. Now things kind of make a little bit more sense, maybe.
Yeah, and I think it opens your eyes to they were all individuals and they all had different priorities, and I think there's a lot in the wills that shows that the mothers were trying to look after their daughters when they were gone. So obviously sons, they got everything anyway, just through law, but you can see that mothers were trying to protect their daughters and make sure they had something. And to me, it's just there's something really nice about reading those. So yeah,
Yeah.
I'd definitely say if somebody is interested in that, have a look at some wills, as depressing as that sounds, because it does sound quite morbid, but it's really interesting.
And I guess the only place that I've ever gone to look up wills is the National Archives site. Is there anywhere else?
Um, Oh, I'm trying to think off the top of my head now. There are individual archives where you can often find wills. So it's worth people checking if they're in England per se, their local archive. They might be able to find them online digitized, or they might be able to go in and have a look. I assume if they're going in to look at the real thing, they'd probably need to request them. But yeah, I'd definitely check your local archives. And then if not, as you've said, the National Archives online, they've got loads. So I could have spent months on there looking at wills.
Yes, it's so fascinating. I love it. Well, Amy, if somebody would like to learn more about your book, Women's Lives in the Tudor Era, where can they find it?
Um, in all your usual places. So it's in most bookstores, I believe. Big and small. So there's independent bookshops that have it, all your bigger ones online. Uh, I think that's it. And it is available in ebook as well. So if anybody prefers ebook over hardcover, then yeah, you can still get it.
Perfect. And if they say want to reach out to you on social media and ask you some questions, where can they find you?
Everywhere. So I am on Facebook. I was going to say Twitter, X. No,
Yeah.
I keep forgetting that
I
it's
keep
changed.
calling it Twitter. It's fine.
Yeah, Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky. So just search my name on all of them. So yeah.
And that's Amy McElroy. Amy, thank you so much for coming on again today.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun. I can't believe it's been an hour.
Time flies when you're having fun.
Yes.
And that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you love the show and would like to show your support, consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. Over there, you'll get commercial-free episodes, early access, and some patron exclusive content as well. If you would prefer to show your support in another way, head on over to my website, tudorsdynasty.com, and click on the shop to see some of the new merchandise that I have available. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.